So we will invite the next speaker from Japan, Ms. Naoko NORO. She joined this seminar in virtual mode, okay, online. So Ms. NORO is the chief training instructor at the Integrated Support Center for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Nuclear Security of the Japan Atomic Energy Agency, JAEA. She has also been invited to several IAEA nuclear security training courses as an expert. Her expertise includes the nuclear security, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive terrorism and international security. Please, Noro-san.
Thank you very much, Kishida-san. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naoko NORO of ISCN of Japan Atomic Energy Agency. I would like to first thank JICC, JICC, and the government of Estonia, Ministry of Environment, to invite me to give the lecture on the nuclear security and the physical protection. I wish I were there with you in person and see you in person, but sorry, I'm joining from Japan, so this is a virtual lecture. So my organization, ISCN, this is ISCN, Integrated Support Center for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Nuclear Security. This is the regional training center on the nuclear nonproliferation and the nuclear security. So we usually provide the training course to the Asian countries and also for the Japanese audiences. And we also have this kind of collaboration with JICC, JICC to provide the support outside of the Asian region. So today I'm so happy to give this lecture, Nuclear Security and Physical Protection. So this morning you have learned about the nuclear safety and also the lessons learned from Fukushima accident. So in order to have the peaceful use of nuclear energy, the safety is really critical to achieve. You need to achieve to use the energy in peaceful manner. And also not just the safety, security is also important to secure the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Safety, security, and also the safeguards, the nuclear non-proliferation, we call it 3 S's. S for the safety, safeguards, and security. So these are the critical 3 pillars for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And I would like to discuss about the nuclear security, especially the, what it means, and also what kind of the measures we can take, and what kind of the threat exists in global arena. So this is the learning objectives of this module. To make you familiarize with the overview of the nuclear security, what's the definition, what's the scope of the nuclear security, and also to understand the development of global trends of nuclear security threat, and understand the roles of a state to develop an effective nuclear security infrastructure, and to describe the objective of the physical protection system, which is one of the essential measures of the nuclear security. So first, I would like to cover this topic, overview of the nuclear security. I'm sure some of you may have heard of nuclear security and may have been very familiar with the terminology nuclear security. So let's take a look at what it means. The nuclear security is the measures to prevent and detect and respond to any malicious act, such as theft of the material, sabotaging of the facility. Sabotage means a deliverable attack, or unauthorized access, illegal transfer of material, or any other malicious acts involving nuclear material, other radioactive substances, or their associated facilities. Those measures are called nuclear security. So the nuclear security, even though it says nuclear, its scope includes not just the nuclear material, but also other radioactive substances, and also their associated facilities, and including the transport. So this is the definition of the nuclear security. So what kind of a threat scenario we need to consider to secure the nuclear material and facilities? So this is the 4 categories that IAEA shows as the threats of nuclear security. So the first scenario of the threat is the theft of a nuclear weapon. So the terrorists, for example, they steal nuclear weapon themselves and use that. That's the type of the threat. Now it is considered as one of the nuclear security threat. And the second one is not just stealing the nuclear weapon, but stealing the nuclear material that could be the ingredients for the improvised nuclear explosive device. For example, the highly enriched uranium or plutonium. So the theft of nuclear material to produce improvised nuclear explosive device. So the nuclear explosive device is a type of nuclear weapon, but the quality is not at the weapon level, so that a malicious agent steal the material and build the improvised nuclear explosive device and use that. That's the second type of scenario. So the third scenario is the theft of radioactive material to produce dirty bomb or radiation exposure devices. I assume some of you have heard of the terminology dirty bomb. Dirty bomb is the bomb using the conventional explosives, not the nuclear explosives, but the conventional explosives with the radioactive material. So that when the bomb explodes, it will spread the radioactive material to disperse in wider areas. That is called dirty bomb. Or radiation exposure device. Radiation exposure device doesn't have to explode, so you can place the radioactive material, radioactive source in public space in hidden way, so that people will not be aware of the presence of that radioactive source. So by sitting close to that source or passing by, those people will get exposed to radiation. That's called the radiation exposure device. So not just the nuclear materials, but also the radioactive materials can be used for malicious intention. And the fourth scenario is not the theft scenario, but the sabotage of the nuclear facility or transport. So this is the deliverable attack against the material of the facility or the critical equipment for safety, which could release radioactive material or cause exposure to radiation. So these are the threats to nuclear security. But I believe you have never heard of the successful nuclear terrorism ever, and that is true. So why do we care? Why do we need to care about nuclear security, securing the nuclear material in the facility? Well, because the nuclear security threat is real. There is an imminent threat. This is not the potential threat, but the real threat exists. And we witnessed many real case examples of the planning of the attacking of the nuclear facilities or failed attempts of such an act. For example, the armed attack on nuclear facility, unlawful intrusion, theft of nuclear materials, illicit trafficking, and so on. And I will show you the slide contains the list of those cases. And also if once those nuclear security events occurred, the consequence would be severe. So it's not just a small bomb explode, but using the nuclear and radioactive substances, the potential consequence of such an act is severe. So the impact goes beyond the borders. Radiation don't respect borders. They can go beyond the borders. So it is very important that each state strengthen its effort for the nuclear security, but also the international community needs to work together to strengthen the nuclear security at the national level, regional, and international level. And this is this shows the historical development of nuclear security threat, but it's very simple. That we have the long history of the nuclear security. So our international efforts of the nuclear security has a long history. And currently, it has a high priority at the international arena. It can go back to, it can also go back to 1950s or 60s, very early stage of the nuclear energy history. And it has started as the nuclear non-proliferation nuclear safeguards measures to make sure the state or the facility will not convert the material into weapon or use the facility for production of the weapon. So need to control the material, need to control the access, and so on. So that's the start of the physical protection, physically protect the material of the facilities. So later that safeguards measures had more meaning of the security. So it began to be called physical protection. And in the 70s and 90s, there are many international big terrorist attack cases, such as attacking in the Munich Olympics, and also the large-scale hijacking and so on. So there are international terror. It is a growing international terrorism. That's the age of the 70s and 80s. So each countries and also the international community strengthen their physical protection measures. And the end of from the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so there are many researchers, technicians, and the workers at the nuclear facilities. They lost jobs and they had the huge financial difficulties. In order to obtain small money, some of them tried to steal the material and sold that material through the black market. So the nuclear technology transfer, illicit trafficking of materials, we had several cases, real cases of those theft of for example, highly enriched uranium or the plutonium in that era. So that accelerate international efforts for nuclear security as well. And the 9/11 came in 2001. It gave the huge impact to international community, and international attention became at the highest level. Excuse me. And from 2000, the terminology physical protection started to be used as the term to the nuclear security. So the nuclear security is more comprehensive approach rather than the physical protection to include radiological substances as well. So, as I said earlier, the threat is imminent. It's not the potential threat. This is the real threat exists. And there are a couple of examples of the nuclear security incidents. Some are very minor events. Some is more serious. So there are cases that the nuclear terrorists, the strong explicit interest in the nuclear terrorism shown by the extremists or the terrorist organization. There are multiple failed attempts to acquire nuclear weapons or nuclear materials by those organizations. And there were some plotted armed attack against nuclear facilities. And actually in South Africa in the early 2000s, armed attack against nuclear facility actually occurred. And also not just South Africa, but some other countries in Africa, Niger, and so on. There were some attacks by armed groups against the nuclear facilities. And there were other unlawful activities in nuclear facilities. For example, there was discovery of non-explosive in a nuclear power plant in Sweden, and intentional sabotage of the turbines in Belgium by a possible insider. And again, the theft and illicit trafficking of nuclear materials. There were cases that detected trafficking of the highly enriched uranium and plutonium, and also the robbery of the radiological materials during the transport. And the theft of a fuel assembly, this is an extreme case, and also unauthorized possession of the nuclear material via internet auction, and this happened in Japan. And I mentioned about the dirty bomb, which uses the conventional explosives with the radioactive materials, the called dirty bomb. And actually, there was a case that the dirty bomb was constructed. So this is the picture of that one. It uses cesium-137, I believe. So there was a case that the dirty bomb was constructed, but it wasn't used. So there was no any consequences. But this is the actual case. That's the unauthorized use of the radiological material. And when it comes to the cyber attacks, it is too many, so I cannot list everything. But there are some cyber attack via malware, and that led to the physical damage of the facility. Not just stealing the information, but physically damage the facility by cyber attack. So these are the examples I would like to show and draw your attention and introduce that the threat is imminent. It's not potential, but there are many real case examples. So that's why we care about nuclear security. And the IAEA published many nuclear security guideline documents. It is called IAEA Nuclear Security Series, and you can download them from the IAEA's website. But one of the important guidance document of the IAEA says that the responsibility for the establishment, implementation, and maintenance of a nuclear security regime within a state rests entirely that state. So the state is responsible to establish the regime, implement, and maintain such regime. So what do I mean by the establishment, implementation, and maintenance of a regime? I have another slide later in this presentation, so I will cover that later. But for effectiveness of a state's nuclear security measures, the international cooperation is also important, because sometimes you need to have the international transport of materials, and the threat itself has the transnational nature. The threat terrorist comes from overseas, and also the consequence, radiation, goes beyond the national borders. So global efforts are essential to have the effective nuclear security in one country. And there are some international nuclear security framework exist, such as the conventions, treaties, which has the legally binding nature, and also the UN Security Council resolutions, and also non-legally binding, such as international guidelines, code of conduct. So there are multiple international framework for nuclear security. So for example, conventions, you may have heard the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, or International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, and so on. You don't have to remember these convention names and so on, but there are new international framework exists. Okay, so let's move to what a state needs to do for having the good nuclear security in its country. So the roles and the responsibilities of a state in nuclear security. So again, I quote from IAEA's guideline document. Objective of a state's nuclear security regime is to protect persons, property, society, and the environment from malicious acts involving nuclear material and other radioactive material. So the protect people, protect its citizens, property, and society, and the environment from from malicious acts. So this objective is very similar to the objective of the state's nuclear safety regime. But for the security regime, the security events caused by the malicious acts. So that's the difference. For the safety, it comes from the accident, errors, natural disaster, and so on. But for the security, it comes from the malicious acts. But what the state need to do is very similar with the safety. So the responsibility for the establishment, implementation, and maintenance of the nuclear security regime within a state rests entirely with that state. I repeat this sentence. So first, establishment of the national nuclear security policy and strategy. So you should have the new national strategy, national policy for the nuclear security. and develop the nuclear security infrastructure, including a legal, regulatory, and institutional framework. You may need to have a law to talk about the nuclear security. You need to have the regulation of the material, facility, licensing, insecurity, and also the institutional framework. That means the regulatory authority, state need to assign a certain agency to give certain responsibility of nuclear security. And implement the nuclear security measures for the nuclear material and facilities, and also that for the radioactive material associated facilities, and implement the nuclear security measures for material out of regulatory control. And I will explain these 5 points just immediately after this slide. So first, national nuclear security policy and strategy. So the importance of the nuclear security needs to be recognized and reflected in the state's policy related to the use of nuclear technology. So it needs to undertake a national threat assessment for the nuclear security because each country has a different threat environment. So this is all, so that the threat environment is identical. So it's not the same. It's not same with other countries. So that each country has its own unique threat environment. So first, IAEA recommends a state to conduct the national threat assessment. What kind of threat you are facing in your country for the nuclear security? What kind of material you have? What kind of facility you have? What types of risks associated with those materials and also the facilities? And also what kind of the threat environment, for example, what kind of the activities that the terrorist groups exist or extremists and so on, those threat environment. First, it is important to have the threat assessment for nuclear security and identify the elements of comprehensive nuclear security infrastructure to deal with such non-threat environment, including appropriate measures for prevention, detection, and the response to nuclear security events. And identify the responsible organization. We call it competent authorities. So the competent authorities is any governmental entities who has specific nuclear security responsibilities. So a country may have multiple competent authorities. And ensure that national nuclear security strategy specifies the nuclear security infrastructure needed. So once you have the policy, you have the strategy, and that strategy should specify what kind of the infrastructure that state needs to develop. And identify what resources you need, financial, human resources, for the implementation of the national nuclear security policy and strategy. So this is the first step, national nuclear security policy and strategy. And once you develop the national policy and national strategy, then you need to have the infrastructure. So one of the major infrastructure for nuclear security is the legal and regulatory framework. I just introduced there are some international conventions, treaties, and UN Security Council resolutions, and so on. So maybe you need to adapt all those relevant international legal instruments for nuclear security to show your international commitment to the nuclear security and also to develop the national infrastructure. So the establishment of a legal and regulatory framework in accordance with those relevant international legal instruments. And adopt legislative provisions for the criminalization of defined acts of the nuclear security. Because as I said earlier, nuclear security events will be caused by malicious acts. So it will be the criminal activities. So you need to have the legislative provisions for the criminalization of certain acts for the criminal investigation, prosecution, and so on. And also need an appropriate legal and regulatory framework supporting the regulatory authorities, for example, and the interfaces between them. So for the authorization, so the competent authorities need to have the legal basis for their authority for conducting the inspections and monitoring the compliance with the regulation, and have the enforcement action and so on. And under this legal and regulatory framework, you may have the physical protection regulation. And the state needs to implement the nuclear security measures for the nuclear material and facilities. And what is the objective of these nuclear security measures for the material and facilities? This is to protect against the theft of nuclear material. And once the material is stolen, to locate and recover that material. And also to protect nuclear material and nuclear facilities against sabotage. Sabotage is again the intentional attack against material and facilities. And once the sabotage occurred, to mitigate or minimize the radiological consequences of sabotage. So the state should define the requirements for the nuclear security measures based on that threat assessment. And the regulatory authority sets with the concrete regulations and implements legislation and do the inspection and verification. And the license holder, the operator, the nuclear facility operator, implements the physical protection and comply with the regulations. This is under the implementation of nuclear security measures for the nuclear material and facilities. And similarly, not just the nuclear material, but also for the radioactive material and facilities, the measures should be designed to deter, detect, and delay unauthorized access to or theft of radioactive material, and allow rapid assessment and appropriate response and recovery of the material and mitigation of the event, and also to provide for rapid response to any attempted or actual theft of radioactive materials. So now again, these are the scope of the nuclear security includes radioactive materials, and radioactive materials, radioactive sources are used in wide areas. For the nuclear material, the use of the material is very limited, but the radioactive material, the use of those sources materials are very wide and has a variety. So do you know where those nuclear radioactive materials are used? For example, medical institute, agricultural industry, or industrial devices, and also for the research, education, and so on. So there are multiple uses of the radioactive sources, so that that each country has many radioactive sources. So those materials also needs to be protected and regulated and protected. And in my in earlier slide, I mentioned about the material out of regulatory control. So this is the implementation of nuclear security measures for materials out of regulatory control. So what does that out of regulatory control mean? So the material that has been reported as being out of the regulatory control to the regulatory authority and other relevant authorities. For example, material that is lost, missing, or stolen, but has not been reported as such, and material that has been discovered. So that usually the material is controlled under the regulation within the facility or the registered place. But once the material is stolen or missing, those materials are now outside of those regulatory control. So, for example, the illicit trafficking or using the radioactive materials as the dirty bomb in the city or and so on, those are considered as the materials out of regulatory control. So having the good regulation for the nuclear material facilities and radioactive material facilities is not sufficient. You need to have the measures for the materials out of those regulatory control. So you need to develop a national detection strategy of a criminal or other unauthorized act with nuclear security implications involving material out of regulatory control. And develop a national response strategy and plan for responding to nuclear security events of materials out of regulatory control. And establish the detection system through instrumental alarm and or information alert. Do you know the difference between the information alert and instrumental alarm? So the information alert, detection by the information alert is, for example, the intelligence agency receives the information that there would be potential attack or potential risk. That's the information alert that can come from the international intelligence community or the bilateral cooperation through the bilateral cooperation or the regional cooperation. And the instrumental alarm is the detection by an instrument, for example, the detectors. Your local police may have the individual detectors when they are patrolling in the city, and they may have the alarm of that instrument. That's instrumental alarm. So for the material out of regulatory control, you may want to develop the detection system through instrumental alarm and or information alert. You need to assign who is responsible for such a detection. Is that police job, or is that the border control, or is this a port of entry job, and so on. So you need to have establish those systems. And also establish an effective first-line response and crime scene management capability, including nuclear forensic capabilities. Again, so the nuclear security incident will brought by malicious acts. So that could be the criminal activity. So you need to have the first line response to such an event and crime scene management. You need to secure the crime scene and collect the evidence and have the analysis of such evidence. And those collected evidences might be contaminated by the radiation. So you need to have the capability to do evidence collection, evidence analysis, which is called the nuclear forensics capabilities. So the initial response to the nuclear security event, like the rescuing, evacuating, monitoring the radiation, those initial responses are same with the safety incident. But for the security incident, you need to have the criminal investigation, crime scene management, analysis capability, and so on. So this is a major difference between the safety incident and the security incident. And also, you may have the multiple competent authorities. So the nuclear security activities varies a lot. As you have seen, there should be the regulatory authority, but also there should be some organization who is responsible for the national strategy, and someone should be responsible for detecting the material, analyzing the material, and so on. So there should be the multiple stakeholders. So it is important for state to identify who is responsible for what. So this is the example key stakeholders for nuclear security. So this is not the holistic list. You may have more, you may have less, depending on your country's nuclear activities, nuclear energy activities. So the competent authorities may include the organization who is responsible for overall national security, regulation of the nuclear security, including the physical protection, or intelligence who is responsible for conducting the threat assessment, information security organization, including the cyber security against the nuclear facilities, and the border protection customs control of immigration, to hold the responsibility to prevent illicit trafficking, or security arrangement for the transport of the materials. You may have the law enforcement to do the criminal investigation. And you may have the organization who is responsible for prosecution and adjudication of alleged offenses, and who is responsible to have the nuclear security plan. This is contingency plan is the response plan. And those agencies who may be responsible for provide response forces, fight against those attackers. And there may be some organization who is responsible for international cooperation to strengthen your own nuclear security. So these are just examples of key stakeholders. Again, you may have more or less depending on your country's nuclear activities. But it is very important to identify who should involve, because you need to have the coordination, good coordination, collaboration among those key stakeholders. And stakeholders may be at national level, but also you may have the local level, facility level. So there are so many complicated coordination among the competent authorities. So this is the summary of the roles and responsibilities of each player. So the state is responsible for establishing the regime, nuclear security regime, and implement and maintain that regime to develop the infrastructure, legal framework, and so on. And the competent authority, government entities who has the responsibility of nuclear security, implement such legislation and regulations. And the license holders comply with those regulations and implement the physical protection at their own facility. This is the quick summary of the roles and responsibilities of a state, relevant competent authorities, and the license holder. Okay, so now let's move to the physical protection, which is one of the essential elements of the nuclear security measures. So the physical protection of nuclear and other radioactive materials, facilities, and associated activities include transport, is an essential element of a state's nuclear security regime. So the physical protection is literally physically protect the material and the facilities. So the physical protection system is an integrated set of physical protection measures, which aims at preventing theft of materials and preventing sabotage. So these are the objectives of the physical protection system. And basic functions of the physical protection systems is to detect, delay, and response. Detecting what? Detect any unauthorized activities, unauthorized entry into the access controlled areas, for example, or detect items prohibited to bring in or bring out of the facility. So the examples of those physical protection systems to have the detection function is intrusion detection sensors, or entry control system, or vehicle or item search, or the security guards themselves, and the nuclear material accounting and control system. And the delay is to increase adversary task time, delay the adversary to complete their malicious acts. For example, the fences, layers of fences, very thick wall or hardened doors, lock, tie down, guards, and so on. And the response is to interrupt or neutralize the adversary. So the response by the security guards or the response forces and the facility communicate with the law enforcement. Those are the functions for response. So the physical protection system has those three basic functions. And on the right side, you have the three-leg stool. So the detect, delay, and response, you need to have the well-balanced three functions to achieve the effective physical protection. So for example, the detection. If you use technologies such as intrusion detection sensors, you may have seen these type of technologies because this is not just a nuclear industry technology, but this is the regular security technologies used everywhere. So you may have the small sensors even in your office or the shopping mall, airport, and so on. So the sensor activated and alarm is reported to the alarm station and the guards check if this is happened by caused by an intrusion or any other small animals and so on. So the detection by detection function, the facility can have the early can find any malicious acts in early stage. But the detection is not complete without assessment. So by using technologies, the sensor is activated by any kind of activities, not just from the intrusion, but for the weather conditions such as the high wind or strong wind, or the animals running through the areas and so on. So you need to assess the cause of an alarm. And it can be done by technologies using, for example, video technologies, or the security guards can go to the site of the alarm and check if what caused that alarm. So it's a combination of the technologies and the people, who is security guards usually. And for delay, function of the delay, again, this is to increase the adversary's time. So that it takes adversary, it adds more time for adversary to complete their task. So put obstacles on adversary path and increase time for adversary completing their task. So increase the probability that response force can interrupt adversary, stop the adversary. You can have the very thick, strong door, highly secured door, or you have the vehicle stopper, or the turnstile gate, which is very difficult to break, or the concrete wall with the rebar. So it is very difficult to penetrate. It takes time to penetrate through. Or the response forces can arrive on time to stop adversary. That's the function of a delay. And these are just the example, but by the presence of the security guards or the response forces, they may be able to delay the adversary. It made adversary too difficult to continue their job. So this is the delay function. And response, communication from the facility to the response forces to ask for the deployment. So the response force deploy their force and engage with the interrupt adversary and engage with the adversary to neutralize them. That's the process of the response. Depending on the country, you may have the response forces on site, or you may need to rely on the response forces to be provided by the outside organizations such as police or the military. So the need for the capable response forces against the threat assessment. So remember I talked about the threat assessment. First, you need to know about your country's threat assessment. What kind of threat you will face. And after you identify that threat, you need to have the capability to respond against such threat. So it is very important that the response forces have capability to do that, and well-trained, well-equipped, and well-informed about the procedures. So these are the basic functions of the physical protection system: detect, delay, and response. And again, this is I said this is a nuclear security physical protection system, but this physical protection system can be used for the radioactive source facilities as well. You may not need such a heavy armed response forces for those facilities, depending on the impact of such sources could cause. But of course, if your regulation says you need to protect radioactive materials, you may need to have the detection, delay, and response functions. And it can be done by the combination of the technology and the people, security guards. Okay, so far I have explained about the overview of the nuclear security and also the international, also the examples of the real cases and international framework, as well as the roles and responsibilities of a state. And also talked about the physical protection. And that covered almost everything I would like to discuss for the nuclear security. So now I would like to move on to provide you some examples of Japan's efforts to strengthen the nuclear security. And after this one, I think I have some time left for the question and answer session. So I mentioned about there are several international frameworks such as the conventions and treaties or the UN Security Council resolutions, IAEA guidelines, and so on. So Japan also commit to those international framework and adapted those major international frameworks into our own legal framework. So the international framework on the left side and Japan's commitment on the right side. So we ratified several international framework and revised our domestic law to comply with those international conventions and frameworks. And IAEA guidelines doesn't have any legally binding nature, so it is up to member states to adopt it or not. So we do not have any legal obligation, but Japan has adopted IAEA recommendations and incorporated those recommendations into its own physical protection regulations and revised our regulations as the IAEA revised their guidelines. So these are the development of the Japan side on the right side and the international framework on the left side. So the legal framework and the principles of Japan is listed here. So at the very top of the legal structure of our nuclear energy, we have Atomic Energy Basic Law. You may have heard of this law in other lectures, so I won't go into the detail, but this is the Atomic Energy Basic Law refers that Japan uses atomic energy and nuclear energy only to peaceful purposes. So this is the top basic law of the atomic energy. And under that law, we have the law for regulation of nuclear source material, nuclear material, fuel material, and reactors. And that regulation contains the regulation of the physical protection of nuclear security. And as I said repeatedly, the nuclear security incident will be brought by the Malicious Act. So in Japan, there is a law concerning the punishment for acts that threaten human lives by release of the radiation. So we criminalize those acts. So establishing the punishment for acts that cause danger to human lives, bodies, and property. And also, not just the nuclear material, but for protecting the radioactive materials, we have the Act on Regulation of Radioisotopes. To develop the regulation to physical protection, to set the physical protection requirements for the radioisotopes. So these are the basic legal framework and principles of Japan for the nuclear security. And I also introduced the key stakeholders, and I listed some of them. Those competent authorities for the nuclear security in terms of regulation. So here we have the nuclear fuel material, a nuclear facility regulation. We have the regulation on the radioisotope, and also we have the regulation on the shipment, area of the shipment. And those three areas is covered by Nuclear Regulation Authority, or NRA. So the NRA covers all of these three areas as the regulatory authorities. So they have the different divisions covering the nuclear material and the radioisotope. But all these facility, material, radioisotope transport is regulated by the Nuclear Regulation Authority. But for the radioisotope and shipment transport, there are other agencies also involved. For the radioisotopes, because the radioisotopes are used in medical area and also the agricultural areas, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture also has a role to play. And for the transport, the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport also has a role. Also, this is the regulatory authorities. These are the agencies that has a responsibility of some kind of regulation. And for the response forces, protecting the facilities, physically provide the response forces to fight against those attackers, adversaries. We have the National Police Agency. So for the commercial power reactors, we have the National Police Agency. So they have the local police on site, stationed inside the facility. And also all the nuclear power plants in Japan are located alongside the coastline, seaside. So the Japan Coast Guard, they are patrolling from the sea. So this is the competent authorities for the nuclear security, for the regulation and the response forces. So for the response, again, so the protecting the nuclear power plants in Japan, that's the role of the police and the Japan Coast Guards. So it may be different in Estonia, so you may have the different entity to do that. And each country has different system players. So this is the example of Japan. Okay, so this is the summary slide. So we have covered the nuclear security scope and definitions. So the nuclear security is the prevention of and detection of and the response to the criminal or intentional acts involving the nuclear material, other radioactive material, associated facilities and activities, such as transport. And in corresponding to the nuclear security incidents and threats in international and the global international arena, the global efforts on the nuclear security has been strengthened. So as there are many incidents in international arena, the international community developed conventions or published the IAEA guidelines and so on to accelerate their efforts to nuclear security. And the responsibility of the state for the nuclear security, the state is responsible for establishing the regime and implement it and maintain it. And the physical protection of material and facility is the essential element of the state's nuclear security regime. And the basic functions of the physical protection system is to detect, delay, and the response. Okay, so this is my last slide. So thank you very much for your kind attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Noro-san, for your comprehensive and informative presentation. Are there any questions for Noro-san, Ms. Noro? Yeah, yes.
Hi. Can you talk more about how cyber security? Is being hacked a big risk, and how do you secure that part, and who is responsible?
Thank you very much for the question about the cybersecurity. So the cybersecurity in the nuclear security means you need to protect the computer system, which is critical to keep the safe operation of the facility, as well as the critical computer system for the security purpose, physical protection purpose. And so if those system is compromised, or any information is stolen from the computer information system, it could lead to the theft of material or the sabotage. That's the definition of and that's the scope of the cybersecurity for the nuclear security. So it's to protect the critical safety computer system as well as the physical protection system. For example, if the physical protection system, computer system is hacked, if you lose the function of the detection, video image, or the sensor information, you cannot detect intrusion, or you cannot follow the intruders. You cannot chase the intruders by video because you lose that function. That may lead to adversary. That may lead to the successful attack by an adversary. So that's the scope of the cybersecurity. And who is responsible? That's a very good question. So first, you need to have the regulatory authority who needs to have developed or any other entities to develop the regulation for the cybersecurity. And at the facility level, the facility needs to assign the certain team or the office for such a cybersecurity. So it's the responsibility of the government side and also at the facility side. And also you may have additional players, additional responsible entities, not just watching the cybersecurity for the nuclear security, but the cybersecurity for the critical national infrastructure. So it depends on how you design the system.
Thank you.
Okay. Any question? Yes, please.
Konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa.
Can you explain how much will be cost all this system of nuclear security for state? How much it costs for state budget? Understand me? It's system, it's cost, people, salary, equipment, and the others. How it will be much for one station for all country?
So
do you know this?
So I don't have that answer because it all depends on how many facilities you have and how many materials you have inside of your countries, how many people you need to have as a human resource and so on. So it all depending on the scale and size of the nuclear activities of the state. So I don't have that answer to your question.
So no any statistic?
No any statistic and also no data available. Because of the security cost, for example, how the security design, security information, the specific security measure information about certain facility is all handled as a classified information, sensitive information. So those data is not available.
Arigato.
Okay. Any other? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question about interaction between safety and security. We are talking about global threats as a cybersecurity, for example. Mm-hmm. It's not actually not depending of the country. It's a global thing. I can do harm from here to Russia and vice versa and so on. So for me, I'm asking your personal opinion, of course, right now, because is it useful to have taken some threats which are global account already in the design phase of the NPP, because afterwards it will be sometimes very hard to implement them. The same goes with the vital areas. What about drones? Yeah, we have maybe very good protection, we have walls, we have teams on site and so on, but we have seen that drones can do very big harmful things. So what about vital areas? And we can maybe take something account also by the design that we avoid those areas.
Thank you very much for the question. That is a very excellent question about the design of the facility and considering the security from the designing phase. And it is sometimes called the security by design. And that is very important. In Japan's case, we started a nuclear power program even before the introduction of the physical protection regulations. So our facilities were originally not designed for having the high level of security. So we added security systems later, and it costed a lot, and also it had very complicated. It needed to redesign and complicated coordination between the safety system and also the security system. And sometimes we had contradictory measures as well. So that if you are designing the nuclear power plants from now, it is you will have you are in a better advantageous position that you can think of the security when you design the facility. So you said the cybersecurity on the drones. So you do the threat assessment, and if you think that drone can bring the huge threat to your facility, you may need to design to prevent such a threat. And for the cybersecurity as well, the critical system, you need to have the independent, not connected to the outside network system, so the standalone system for your critical safety system, as well as a critical physical protection system. So you need to design the system network as like that. And for, again, vital areas, you need to do the threat assessment. And the vital areas should have the capability to delay the adversary and detect the adversary to attack those areas. So that the security by design concept is really important, critical. So you have the really good point, sir.
Okay. Any other? Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Sylvester from MOI, and I have the same question as Kalle had in the morning session. So basically, we have seen in our region that some countries use strategic dependencies as a weapon against other countries' sovereign decisions or their independence. How does Japan avoid strategic dependencies on that sector in the nuclear energy sector? Thank you.
I don't know if I can understand your question correctly. So the dependence on the.
So as we know.
Would you rephrase the question?
Yes, I can give you an example. If, for example, Germany is dependent on Russian gas and oil, so they are not able to pressure or to stand against some decisions, what needs to be done. So what does Japan do to have the sovereignty in their decisions, not to be dependent on others countries, companies or technologies? Thank you.
Well, that's a very important and very big question, and I don't know if I can answer to that question. So maybe other JICC experts can jump in. So I believe you were talking about the energy security. So that you need to have that secure energy source in order to avoid such a dependence on the other countries. And so this is go beyond the nuclear security type of the topic. So so I believe that the countries need to have the secured source of the energy, but the Japan doesn't have the secured energy source. We import the oils, coals from outside. So the nuclear energy is one of the energy that could contribute to the nuclear security energy security. So that is why I believe the Japanese government is promoting the use of the nuclear energy as one of the energy source in Japan. So that's the only thing I can answer to this question. And I welcome other Japanese experts to jump in to answer such a very important question. Kishida-san or anybody.
Okay. Any other comment? No? Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Noro-san.